The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope, the kind my mother always used for anything she considered important: birth announcements, funeral programs, the save-the-dates for my own wedding all those years ago, back before everything in my life took the turns she never quite forgave me for. For a moment, sliding my thumb under the flap while my coffee went cold on the counter, I let myself believe this was going to be a good day. 6 months of planning had gone into this family cruise, a milestone trip to celebrate her 70th birthday, the whole family sailing the Mediterranean for 10 days, stopping in Santorini and Dubrovnik and some port in Sicily my mother had circled in every brochure she'd shown me over Sunday dinners since January. I'd already blocked the dates off work, arranging 6 months in advance with my manager for the leave, something that wasn't easy to negotiate as the senior analyst on my team. I'd already bought sunscreen for my 6-year-old twins, the reef-safe kind, 3 bottles because Caleb liked to squeeze half a bottle out at once if I wasn't watching closely. I'd already pictured it in vivid, specific detail: Caleb and Owen pressed against a ship railing watching dolphins, their matching sun hats, the way Owen got quiet and awestruck around big water, while Caleb narrated everything he saw at top volume. I'd pictured my mother laughing at something one of them said, finally, after 6 years of careful distance, softening into the grandmother I'd always hoped she'd become. Then I opened the envelope and read the guest list twice, because surely I'd misunderstood the first time. I read it a third time at the kitchen table, running my finger down the elegant calligraphy, like the physical act of tracing the letters might rearrange them into something different. Every grandchild was named. My sister Denise's 3 kids, Mia, Jacob, and little Ava, who'd just turned 2. My brother Todd's daughter, Sophie, listed carefully with her allergy restrictions noted in my mother's precise handwriting, because of course my mother would think to accommodate a peanut allergy, but somehow forget an entire branch of the family existed. Even our cousin's baby, barely 8 months old, included with a note about bassinet arrangements and a request to the cruise line for a crib in the cabin. Caleb and Owen weren't there. Not omitted by accident, the list was too detailed, too deliberate for that. Someone had sat down with a pen and a guest manifest and specifically decided which children belonged on that ship and which didn't. I felt something in my stomach drop the way it does when you miss a step in the dark, that half second of falling before your body catches up to what's happening. I sat there for a long moment, the invitation trembling slightly in my hands, before I made myself stand up, walk to the sink, and splash cold water on my face like that might wash away the beginning of a feeling I already recognized and already dreaded. Then I called her immediately, my hands not quite steady as I dialed, sitting back down at the table because my legs didn't feel entirely reliable. "Mom, the boys aren't on the cruise list." There was a pause. The particular kind of pause I'd learned over 34 years meant she'd rehearsed this conversation and was waiting for her cue, waiting for me to say the line that would let her deliver the response she'd already prepared. I could practically hear her setting down whatever she'd been holding, positioning herself for the conversation like she was settling into a chair before a difficult meeting. "It's a big trip, sweetheart. 10 days is a long time for children that age. All that time in close quarters, all those excursions and formal dinners. I just think it'll be easier on everyone if it's the older kids this time. Give you a little break, too. You work so hard." "They're the same age as Ava," I said, naming my sister's youngest, my voice climbing slightly despite my best efforts to keep it level. "Ava's 2. She's going to be in a stroller the entire trip. Ava's on the list." "Ava's different," my mother said, and something in her voice shifted, hardened at the edges in a way that told me the rehearsed portion of the script had run out, and she was improvising now, reaching for whatever justification presented itself fastest. "You know how your father feels about certain things. He just wants a peaceful trip. At his age, with his heart the way it is, I don't want any stress." "What things, Mom? What exactly does Dad need protection from?" "My 6-year-olds. Don't twist my words, Sarah." "I'm not twisting anything. I'm asking you to say it plainly for once, instead of circling around it the way you always do." She didn't answer right away, and in that silence I understood then what she wasn't saying. What she'd never quite said out loud in 6 years, but had circled endlessly, in comments about complicated situations, and not the traditional way we pictured things, and the careful, deliberate way she introduced my sons to her friends at church without ever mentioning their father, or the fact that I'd had them through a surrogate after 4 devastating years of losses that nearly broke me and my marriage both, or the fact that I was raising them alone by choice now, since the divorce, the way I wanted to, the way that actually worked for us, even if it didn't match the tidy family portrait she'd always imagined for herself. I thought about the Christmas 2 years ago when she'd introduced the boys to her book club friends as Denise's other kids, a slip she'd laughed off as exhaustion, though I'd noticed she never made that particular slip about anyone else's children. I thought about the way she'd once asked me, gently, almost kindly, if I'd considered what it might be like for them, growing up without the full picture, as though a donor conception and a surrogate and a mother who loved them fiercely wasn't a full picture, wasn't a whole and complete story, just because it didn't match the one she'd have written for me herself. He's ashamed of them, I said quietly, finally, the words landing heavier in the kitchen than I expected them to, heavier than I'd let myself think them in 6 years of careful avoidance. That's what this is, isn't it? That's what this has always been. That's not fair, Sarah. Her voice cracked slightly, and for one brief moment I almost softened, almost reached for some gentler interpretation, some story where this was really about cabin space or excursion logistics or anything other than what I already knew it was. No, I agreed, steadier now than I'd expected to feel. It isn't. None of this has been fair, not for 6 years. But I think we both know that already. I hung up before she could soften it into something more palatable, before she could offer some compromise. Maybe the boys could join for just the first 2 days. Maybe we could arrange a separate, smaller celebration afterward. Some half-measure designed to make the wound feel smaller, without actually closing it. I didn't want a half-measure. I wanted, suddenly, and with startling clarity, to stop accepting half-measures altogether. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, the invitation still open in front of me, listening to Caleb and Owen laughing in the next room over some cartoon, their voices rising and tumbling over each other the way they always did, completely unaware that their grandmother had just decided, in careful cream-colored ink and rehearsed phone call excuses, that they didn't belong on a boat with their cousins, didn't belong in the family photographs that would decorate her mantel for years afterward, didn't belong, period, in the version of the family she was willing to present to the world. I thought about all the small accommodations I'd made over the years to keep the peace, the excuses I'd built for her out of love and hope and the particular optimism of a daughter who kept believing her mother would eventually come around. I thought about how tired I suddenly was of building those excuses, brick by patient brick, only to watch them get quietly dismantled every single time. The family group chat exploded within the hour, because of course my mother had already told my siblings before she'd even confirmed anything with me, already built her narrative before I had the chance to build mine. I imagined her sitting at her own kitchen table earlier that morning, phone in hand, carefully drafting a version of events that painted her as reasonable and me as the one who'd overreact when she inevitably would. My sister Denise texted privately first, before the group chat had even fully caught fire. I didn't know until this morning, I swear. I already told her this isn't okay. I believed her. Denise had always been the sibling who noticed things, who'd once quietly slipped me an extra $200 during the roughest month of my divorce without ever mentioning it again, who'd cried actual tears the day Caleb and Owen were born, holding them each in turn like she couldn't quite believe her sister had managed to build something so improbable and good out of so much loss. My brother Todd said nothing at all in the group chat, not even a reaction emoji, which told me everything about where his loyalties would land if it ever came down to an actual choice. Todd had always been the peacekeeper, or maybe just the conflict avoider, the one who left the room whenever voices rose at holiday dinners, who'd learned early that staying silent was easier than picking a side, even when picking a side was the only decent thing left to do. The group chat itself filled with a strange, stilted kind of chaos, my aunt weighing in with a comment about how these things happen, families are complicated, which helped no one and clarified nothing. My cousin, the one with the 8-month-old getting a bassinet on the ship, sent a single confused question mark, apparently just now noticing the guest list discrepancy herself. My mother said nothing at all in the chat, which was its own kind of answer, the silence of someone who'd already decided the conversation wasn't worth having in a format where everyone could see her reasoning laid bare. I didn't cry, though I'd expected to at some point during that long afternoon. What I felt instead was a strange, clarifying stillness, the kind that comes when a suspicion you've been carrying quietly for years finally gets confirmed out loud, spoken by the very person you'd hoped might prove you wrong. I sat with my phone in my lap and let the messages pile up unanswered, and I thought about every small moment over 6 years that I'd talked myself out of seeing clearly. I thought about every birthday party where my mother forgot to put the boys' names on the cake, twice, 2 separate years, always with the same flustered apology afterward about how the bakery must have made an error, though somehow the bakery never made that particular error with anyone else's grandchildren. I thought about every family photo where she'd angle the camera just slightly so Caleb and Owen ended up at the edge of frame, half cropped out before the picture even printed, while Denise's kids and Todd's daughter were arranged carefully front and center like they were the ones being documented for posterity. I thought about every Christmas where my sister's kids got engraved stockings, their names in gold cursive thread, hung with obvious care along the mantel, while my sons got generic stockings from the drugstore, plain red felt with a plastic Santa clip, because we ran out of time to order more. Sweetheart, I'll fix it next year. Next year had come and gone 3 times now, and the stockings had never been fixed. I thought about the time Owen, only 4 then, had asked me in the car after a family dinner why Grandma Ruth didn't have any pictures of him and Caleb on her refrigerator, like she did of his cousins. I'd told him some soft, forgettable lie about how grandmothers sometimes take a while to update things, and I'd gripped the steering wheel the entire drive home fighting back a rage I didn't yet have a name for, a rage that had apparently been quietly compounding interest for years, waiting for a moment exactly like this one to finally come due. I'd made excuses for her for 6 years. I'd told myself grief made her strange. She'd lost her own mother the year the twins were born, and grief does odd, unpredictable things to people, hollowing out patience in places you don't expect. I'd told myself it was generational, that a 70-year-old woman raised in a small conservative town might simply need time to catch up to the family I'd built, the family that didn't look like the one she'd pictured for me at my wedding all those years ago, before the marriage ended and I decided, deliberately and without apology, to become a mother anyway on my own terms, through whatever path got me there. I told myself 100 small lies to avoid the one truth sitting quietly underneath all of them, patient and undeniable. My mother had drawn a line around my sons the moment they were born, and every year since, she'd simply been maintaining that line rather than erasing it the way I kept hoping she eventually would. That evening, once the boys were bathed and read to and finally asleep, their nightlight casting its soft blue glow across the hallway, I sat down at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't really want, just something to hold on to while I thought. I opened my laptop and, almost without deciding to, pulled up the family trust documents my father had set up years ago, documents I'd helped organize meticulously after his stroke, back when I was the one who flew in for 6 straight weeks to manage his medications, coordinate his physical therapy, and sit with him through the frightening early days when we didn't yet know if he'd walk again, while my siblings visited on weekends between their own busy lives and called it equal effort, satisfied with themselves for showing up at all. I was also, as it turned out, buried in language I'd read a dozen times over the years but never fully registered the weight of, the trust's designated successor trustee, a fact my mother had apparently forgotten in the fog of party planning and cruise brochures, because the document itself was airtight, drafted years ago by a careful estate attorney who'd anticipated, perhaps better than any of us had, exactly this kind of family fracture eventually surfacing. I read through the provisions slowly, my tea going cold beside me, understanding for the first time just how much quiet authority I'd been sitting on without ever using it, without ever even considering using it, because using it had always felt like something reserved for real emergencies, real crises, not petty family slights I'd talked myself into tolerating for the sake of peace. This didn't feel petty anymore. This felt, finally, like the emergency it had probably always been, dressed up for years in the softer language of misunderstandings and generational gaps and grandmothers who just needed time. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anger, exactly, though the anger was there, banked low and steady beneath everything else. Mostly from the quiet, methodical work of finally deciding, clause by clause, document by document, what I was willing to accept going forward and what, after 6 years of quiet accommodation, I simply wasn't willing to accept anymore. The cruise sailed without us, all glittering and photographed for the family album my mother would no doubt curate to erase our absence entirely, cropping around the empty spaces where Caleb and Owen should have stood the way she'd been cropping around them in photographs for years already. I saw a handful of pictures anyway, posted by my cousin who apparently hadn't gotten the memo about keeping things quiet, my mother in a wide-brimmed sun hat on some sunlit deck, Denise's kids splashing in a pool shaped like a seashell, Todd's daughter grinning gap-toothed beside a dolphin sculpture in Santorini. I looked at them exactly once, felt the expected twist in my stomach, and then closed the app and didn't open it again for the rest of the trip. I didn't call to fight about it again. I didn't send an angry email demanding an apology I already knew wasn't coming, at least not in any form I'd recognize as genuine. Instead, I spent those 3 weeks doing something quieter and, I suspected, far more consequential. I met with my father's estate attorney, a soft-spoken, precise man named Harold Weiss who drafted the original trust documents and who listened to my account of the guest list and the 6 years before it, with the kind of careful, unhurried attention that made me realize how rarely anyone had simply let me finish a sentence about all of this without jumping in to soften it or explain it away. "You've had the authority to make these decisions for 2 years, Harold told me, tapping a pen against the folder of documents between us. "Since your father's stroke. I assumed you knew." "I knew," I admitted. "I just never thought I'd need to use it." "Most people don't until they do," he said, not unkindly. "The question isn't whether you have the power, Sarah. It's whether you're ready to use it in a way you can live with afterward." I thought about that question more than any other over those 3 weeks. Whether I could live with it. Whether using leverage against my own mother, the woman who'd taught me to ride a bike and sewed my Halloween costumes and sat up with me through my first heartbreak decades ago, made me something I didn't want to become. Someone who wielded money and property as weapons in a family that was already fracturing badly enough without my help. But then I'd watch Caleb and Owen at breakfast, watch Owen carefully lining up his cereal pieces by size the way he did every morning, watch Caleb narrate an entirely invented story about his toy dinosaurs with the kind of unself-conscious joy only a 6-year-old can manage, and I'd remember the guest list, the careful calligraphy excluding them by name, the years of edge-of-frame photographs and forgotten stockings, and a grandmother who couldn't bring herself to hang their pictures on a refrigerator door. And I'd think, whatever discomfort I felt about using leverage was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the discomfort of watching my sons quietly absorb, year after year, that they mattered less. 3 weeks after the cruise sailed, I sat across from my mother at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd once fed me breakfast before school, buttered toast and orange juice in the same yellow glass every morning without fail, the same table where she'd shown me the guest list all those weeks ago and broken something between us that I wasn't sure could ever be fully repaired. She looked tired when I arrived, tanned from the cruise, but somehow smaller than I remembered her, as though the trip had cost her something she hadn't budgeted for. "I wondered if you'd come," she said, gesturing for me to sit, already reaching for the kettle out of old habit before catching herself and setting it back down, unsure now, I think, of what kind of visit this actually was. "I need to talk to you about the trust," I said, and I watched her face shift, watched some old wariness settle into her features, the look of someone bracing for a conversation she'd hoped to avoid indefinitely. I laid out papers of my own across the table she'd once laid the guest list on, the symmetry of it not lost on either of us, I think. "The trust that pays your monthly distribution," I said, keeping my voice level, businesslike, though my heart was going harder than I wanted to admit. "The one that covers the house, your car payment, the golf club membership Dad loved so much. I'm the trustee now. Have been since his stroke. You just never asked, and I never brought it up because I never thought I'd need to." Her face went pale in that particular way I recognized instantly, the color draining from her cheeks even beneath the fresh Mediterranean tan. "Sarah, what are you saying?" "I'm saying the distributions continue as normal," I said, and I watched some of the tension leave her shoulders before I continued. Because Dad set this up specifically to protect you, and I'm not interested in punishing you financially for being unkind to my children. That's not who I want to be, and it's not what Dad would have wanted either. I paused, letting that land, letting her understand this wasn't the retaliation she might have braced herself for. But the vacation house? The one on the lake, the one you always host the extended family gatherings at every 4th of July, every Thanksgiving, every summer reunion? That's held in the trust too, and I control how it's used going forward. You wouldn't. Her voice had gone thin, almost childlike in its disbelief, and for a moment I saw something in her face that looked almost like the mother I remembered from before all of this, before 6 years of careful, deliberate exclusion had calcified into something neither of us quite knew how to name. I would, I said, and I was surprised by how steady I felt saying it. My sons will be welcome there every single holiday, exactly like every other grandchild, with their names on the stockings and their pictures on whatever mantle exists in that house, or nobody gathers there at all. If that's a problem for you, we can discuss alternative arrangements for family gatherings going forward, ones that don't involve a house I control. She stared at me for a long moment, something crumbling behind her carefully composed features, years of practiced composure, finally giving way to something rawer underneath. You're punishing me. No, I said, and I meant it, though I understood why it might feel that way to her. I'm just done building a family around your comfort instead of my son's place in it. I spent 6 years making excuses for you, Mom. 6 years telling myself you'd come around, that grief or generational gaps or whatever story I could construct would eventually resolve into you loving my children the way you love your other grandchildren. I don't think that's coming. And I'm not willing to keep waiting for it at their expense. I do love them, she said, and her voice cracked in a way that almost undid my resolve. Sarah, I do. Then show them, I said quietly. Not me. Because right now, all they know is that they weren't on a boat with their cousins. All they'll remember, when they're old enough to understand what that guest list actually meant, is that their grandmother decided they didn't belong. I'm not interested in punishing you, Mom. I'm interested in making sure that never happens to them again. You get to decide if you want to be part of that family going forward. But you don't get to decide my boys aren't. She didn't say anything else, not really, just sat there with her hands folded on the table, staring at the papers between us like they might rearrange themselves into something more forgivable if she looked at them long enough. I gathered my things and stood, and at the door, she called out, Sarah, in a voice so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers. I turned back. I'll bring them by on Sunday, I said. If you want to actually get to know them. Not perform, knowing them for the family photo album. Actually know them. I didn't wait for her answer. I wasn't sure, honestly, that I needed one yet. I drove home with the windows down, the summer air rushing and loud enough to drown out the small, sad part of me still grieving the mother I'd wished she could be, the one who existed clearly in old photographs from my own childhood, but seemed to have quietly disappeared somewhere in the years since, replaced by someone more careful, more guarded, more willing to sacrifice her grandson's sense of belonging for the sake of a version of the family that fit some old, unspoken idea of what a family was supposed to look like. Caleb and Owen were waiting at my sister's house, where Denise had watched them for the afternoon, and when I walked in they ran to me full speed, unaware of trust documents or cruise ships or grandmothers who drew careful lines around love in cream-colored calligraphy. Denise caught my eye over their heads and raised an eyebrow, silently asking how it had gone, and I just shook my head slightly, not now, later, when the boys were asleep and we could talk properly. I picked both boys up at once, one on each hip even though they were getting too big for it now, all elbows and knees and the particular sweaty hair smell of children who'd spent the afternoon playing hard, and I held on longer than necessary, breathing them in, thinking that whatever else I'd lost that summer, whatever fragile, imperfect relationship with my mother might never fully recover from what I'd had to do to protect them, I still had everything that actually mattered held right there, in my arms, laughing and squirming and utterly unaware of how close they'd come to spending their whole childhoods on the edges of a family that couldn't quite decide if they belonged. They belonged. I'd make sure of that, for as long as I had breath to insist on it.